Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. There are a lot of rules in Islam. Personally, I grew up, like many people in my circle, being told that our religion is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. And by and large, it is. But the deeper you explore our religion, the more you're exposed to the vast world of sunnahs, of rules, of recommendations, of practices. And sometimes we come across rules and recommendations that make us feel confused or overwhelmed. For a busy bee living in the 21st century, juggling between work, family, health, and strenuous social circles, what happens when we feel burdened by Islamic rulings and recommendations? How can we make sense of rules that feel disconnected from our perspectives and our daily lives? How can we understand the wisdom behind rulings that we find difficult to follow? That's what I wanted to find out from Dr. Tesneem Alkiek, our guest for today's episode of DoubleTake. DoubleTake is a podcast by Yaqeen Institute about the questions and ideas around Islam and Muslims that give us pause. Before we jump in, please remember to subscribe and rate the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. It makes a big difference. And please share your thoughts directly with our team using the link in the description. Let us know what you like, what you dislike, and what you want to see more of. Dr. Tesneem has a PhD in Islamic Studies with a focus on the development of Islamic law from Georgetown University. She completed her undergraduate degree in early Christianity and Islamic Studies. And at Yaqeen, she develops curricula and other resources for communities to engage with Yaqeen's research. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Tesneem, assalamu alaikum and welcome to DoubleTake.
Wa alaikum assalam. It's great to be here with you guys.
I can't believe it's taken this long to have you on DoubleTake. Inshallah, this is the first of many. Dr. Tesneem, I personally enjoy learning about my faith. And I learn things every day that inspire me to do more good deeds and work toward my afterlife. This season alone, I've had a renewed motivation to study and reflect on the Quran, for example. But sometimes learning seems to have the opposite effect. It feels like Islam has given us rules and recommendations we have to follow for everything in life. We're told how to do everything from waking up to going to sleep and everything in between. And in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He desires ease for us and not hardship. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ was sent as a mercy, not just to human beings, but to all creation. But sometimes it just feels like having a lot of rules is making life more difficult. And if Islam is supposed to make my life better, how do I manage the feeling of being burdened by too many rules? That's the topic of today, and that's your first question.
That's a great question. And I think that there's so many different ways to answer the question. We can talk about how, no, Islam is great and not everything's a burden. But I think what we really need to get at is why we're asking this question in the first place. What is it that, leads to the way we think about religion today that makes us view our responsibilities within religion as a burden? And that goes back to just a couple centuries ago with the Enlightenment. So in the Western world, you have a few major events that really change the history of the world. You have the French Revolution, you've got the Protestant Reformation, and then around the 19th century, you've got what is known as the Enlightenment. And really, as a way to summarize it, it's just like, it's this time where people are moving away from religion and really taking science much more seriously. That scientific theory, scientific method, this is really what gives us reason and rationality, and this is how we think about the world, among various other things that are happening. But this is really important because what happens is that religion, for the first time in really all of history, and I say religion here as the idea of worshiping something. It doesn't necessarily have to be an Abrahamic religion, but paganism, idolatry, the idea that you're structuring your life around worship of something else, whether it's a thing or a divine being. That really defined history for so long. And so what happens with the Enlightenment is that now we're starting to see a separation. You've got the beginning of secular thought where there's this notion which ends up becoming, separation of church and state and a lot of what we see today. What happens is that you see for the first time people are now identifying religion as sort of a separate entity. That I can be a person, but my religious identity is not what defines me. Now, with this sort of these seeds of thought, what's happening is that we think of religion as what we can call utilitarian. It's what utility do we derive from religion? What do we gain out of religion? And if religion doesn't benefit us, then we sort of put it to the side. And so today, when we see in society today, how is religion used? Religion's used when, you know what, I'm at a low point and I really need help. Religion's used for that Sunday service, that, once a week service that I'm going to go ahead and, have a sense of community. Religion is used for, for family, but it's always, you're talking about a purpose. And that is so counterintuitive to the identity of a Muslim because, as you mentioned, Islam, it's not just a religion as other religions are defined, but it provides a way of life.
If I understand you properly, you're saying society is moving away from religion as a way of life to something that happens kind of privately as part of your life, or a certain, part of your life. But it's certainly not your whole life. I get
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
But I have a burning question. Like as a practicing Muslim, I'm asking you as someone who is practicing, you're, mashallah, heavily involved in the output of Yaqeen. And so I can just imagine that you're effectively trying your best in practicing all the rules of Islam. Mm-hmm. Don't you feel, Dr. Tesneem, that Islam has too many rules? Don't you feel it?
So I think, no. I don't think Islam has any rules. I think that's a short answer. But it's because I don't think of what I have to do as a Muslim as rules, as limitations. It's really important. You really have to have the mindset there that religion isn't there to serve your needs, but you are there to serve religion. You are there to serve God as part of your religion. And so really the way that we really need to conceptualize our relationship is that in a way, it's utilitarian because we're getting benefit, but it's also about giving back. And you think about all of the rules, right? All the quote unquote rules. There's when you look at Islam holistically and everything that you're required to do, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, they all bring benefit to us in this life. And I think that's what's so unique about Islam compared to any other religion.
And you're saying like these rules are supposed to benefit me, get me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a specific rule that me personally, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, okay? There's many, but there's one that I wanted to raise. Every Ramadan, I'm praying Taraweeh, right? I'm reading Quran. I'm doing as much as I can to be my best self in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then I see my wife, who just because she has, she goes through menstruation, part of Ramadan, she doesn't have that opportunity. She can't pray Taraweeh. And there's certain other things she can't do. And I feel like that's a very heavy rule, So what happens when I dig a little bit deeper in our religion and uncover rules that make me feel a little bit uneasy, because I can't see the logic?
Well, in that particular question, and I think this goes to almost every question that people ask, and this is what I say. Why are we asking these types of questions? When it comes to something like menstruation and, the way that the relationship we have, the way we, really talk about it today, I would venture to say that the reason we have so much contention and so much sort of this awkward relationship when we talk about it is because we're influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And in Christianity, and Judaism really, that the period, your menstrual cycle, is something that's considered inherently dirty or unpurified. And so as Muslims, we assume that's the same case for us in our religion, that's something that we hear and that we're told. And so then when we think, oh, you can't pray because you're on your period, that's something degrading, that's something unpurifying, and this is, now I'm being relegated to my home. I mean, this is ridiculous because historically, this was a gift for Muslim women, that not having to pray is a break. And it's not necessarily a break from worship, of course, but I think about, all of my friends who have children, and the stories they have after labor, and the exhaustion that people talk about that first month after labor. And I think, subhanAllah, what an incredible blessing it is that you have the period of nifas, of 3 weeks to 30 days to a certain period where you don't have to pray after giving birth, and that allows you to be able to sleep through the night with the very little time you have to sleep. Same thing throughout the year, when you're on your cycle. And this is something that is really I think a blessing. And I think the only reason we don't see it as that is because we've inherited this Judeo-Christian tradition that the greater society really revolves around. And I would just add here that what I love about it, especially in Ramadan, is that it forces you to be creative in your worship, and that makes me a more holistic person. So I think it's really about, like, how are we thinking about these questions and these issues, and really thinking about it from sort of this optimistic perspective, or looking for that source of good, and you'll find it in every case.
Honestly, I'm satisfied with that answer. Tick. Jazakallah khair.
Alhamdulillah. Oh, yeah.
I guess what you're saying is there's genuine hikmah behind every rule. So what does it require of me to appreciate the hikmah behind some of the rules that make me feel, uncomfortable?
So there's a couple of things. And I think that, again, it goes back to, okay, why are we asking these questions? And I know I'm gonna sound like a broken record by the end of this, but I think that this is really the source of so many of our problems as a Muslim community, that we're asking questions that we're not forming in our heads, but what we are being informed of, and then we start doubting. And so what happens is, like, you're opening the Quran, and it's Ramadan, you're trying to connect, it's any time of the year, and you come across a verse on, inheritance laws, and we'll get to that in a second. Or you come across verses on stoning or something like that, and you're reading it, and what you're doing is you're reading it with what you can call a hermeneutics of suspicion. That you're coming in and approaching these texts with doubt, whether you admit it or not, because a lot of the questions that we have in our minds are in a way subconscious, based, again, from larger society. And this is not just a non-Muslim society. This is very much a Muslim society as well. The questions we're asking are based off of what we hear time and again, and it becomes almost subconscious. That even me, I'm someone who this is what I want to do. I want to study Islamic studies for the rest of my life. I think of myself as a committed Muslim, but I still open a text and I think to myself, like, well, does this really make sense? And this is kind of
so
irrational.
where does that come from? Where does that come from? Where does that unease come from?
The hermeneutics of suspicion really comes from, various sources, right? But primarily Islamophobia in general, but also distrust of religion altogether. And so when you think about approaching rulings that make you uncomfortable, I think that's really important. And we can go into a few examples. Can I go into an example of inheritance?
Yeah, I want that example, but I just before the example, like, you're saying that Islamophobia and many other things give you that suspicion of religion, but for practicing Muslims, Dr. Tesneem, like, our default position is husn al-dhan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, it's that we believe that Allah wants the best for us. We actually genuinely believe that. But even with that, default position, where we look at these verses and we're uncomfortable, like inheritance, I'm a male, so I should, I profit from the laws of Islam. but
so you think?
Well, exactly right. That's my preconception. But there are rules where, even with that umbrella of husn al-dhan and believing that this is the best thing for me, I still feel uncomfortable. So before we answer the inheritance question, which I'm really curious to hear your answer on, how do you respond to that?
So I think anytime you feel sort of a little discomfort, I think that's natural and that's okay. And I think that's what makes us, again, unique as Muslims, because going back to something I mentioned earlier, the whole idea of a Protestant Reformation, why did Christians sort of break off from Catholicism, was because they were always trained that you don't question anything. And it's very different from a Muslim's perspective, that in fact, you're welcomed, you're encouraged to be asking questions. It's okay to be feeling this way. And seeking knowledge is one of the most most rewarding things you can do as a Muslim. So it's like almost like bait. Like, hey, you have a question, you have a concern. Well, learn more, find out more, and the sort of, I don't think there's anything more satisfying in my life than when I find the answer to the question that I've been looking for whether it's months or years. Finding that answer brings the most like settling conviction that you can't derive from a lecture or from asking someone else. So to really think of these moments as an invitation to learn more and to really try to understand as much as you can.
Okay, so let's get on to inheritance then. That's a very hairy rule. It's heavy, and for someone living in the 21st century in a Western society, it's heavy. It's big, and it's confusing. Why does a man get more than a woman, basically? So how do I come to terms with that? Something as basic as that, and there are many other rules, but let's just use this example since you brought it up of inheritance.
So I'm going to get to the inheritance example in a second, but before I get to that, I want to set the stage by talking about just divorce. That was the focus of my graduate research, and something I'm still very much interested in today. But I remember when I started reading, you have to really be familiar with all of the academic literature, even as much Muslim literature as possible on a topic before you begin, your dissertation. And I cannot explain to you the number of books that talk about how Islam is this is ridiculous. Islam is so unjust. It's so irrational. It's so the whole tirade. Because what? Because of the divorce laws that Islamic law have. And here, me being human, I'm being affected by what I'm reading. I'm thinking to myself, geez, like what's up with this, right? And what I found was so ironic, and this goes back to why do we ask these questions? Here I am reading all this stuff. I'm starting to think. I'm starting to doubt like what's going on here, and and I'm looking as I'm trying to explore the scene. I look into American laws. I look into Western laws of divorce for women, and lo and behold, you have what the Prophet ﷺ gives. Defines divorce, offers divorce rights for women back in 7th century Arabia. And it wasn't until, I'm not kidding you, until for some US states, up until the 1970s, where a woman could even take her husband to court, let alone even initiate a divorce. And it really, I think it just puts so much into perspective, because so many times we ask questions because we feel like we're in this position of inferiority, whether it's just because you're religious in general or because you're Muslim in specific, that you're being told like, well, you must be irrational because, and believe me, in undergrad I was called out time and again in my classes that, well, your opinion is subjective because you're clearly a religious person. And I always was baffled by that, because again, so like, why, there's always this assumption that you're inferior, that you're lacking rationality, all of these things. And I turned to myself, I'm looking at the American history. Let's not even get to the, all of European history. And that, Muslim women had divorce rights over 1,000 years before the world. And the same thing goes with inheritance laws, because I think sometimes we pass over it. Oh, inheritance laws, like, no, this was something that was empowering for women. And it really, really is if you look at the context of history. And until today, what we have in the inheritance laws is infamously that you're reading through the Quran and it's very clear that daughters get half of what the sons get. And you get that feeling like, oh, I knew it. That here I was, everything they told me was true. I'm done, right? And you kind of want to just pack up your bags and call it quits. And it's ironic, because when you look at it, the idea of even women getting inheritance is in France, it was the mid 20th century. We're talking decades ago, and I can say as a Muslim, like, inheritance laws were over 1,000, almost 1,500 years ago, were given to women. It's so incredibly unprecedented, especially when you look at the so-called, modernized and progressive West that is so, has so much fun pointing to the Muslim world and talking about how backwards everything is. But you look deeper, right? It's not just about that, comparing and contrasting. You look at the bigger picture. How does Islam construct society? How does Islam, what are the responsibilities afforded upon each individual? And it's incredibly simple that Islamically, the husband, the son, the male in the family was required to spend on his family. And I know, and I think it's very hard for us to recognize this because we live in such a vastly different world today where in so many families, you've got two breadwinners. And so we think to ourselves, well, that's so outdated. But you think about it historically, right? We're talking about like all of history. You can count on your fingers the number of matriarchal societies that exist throughout history.
So Dr. Tasneem, like everything you've mentioned now about the inheritance piece is that it was progressive back then. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that. And most, everything I read about Islam and any of those rules that I'm mentioning that feel a little bit kind of uncomfortable for me, I know that they were progressive back then, but they're certainly not, they feel like they don't fit in the life that I live in the West at the moment. Like they're very, very contra to the purpose. Like the inheritance law, the idea of women actually getting inheritance back then, 100%, that's so revolutionary. But here in the 21st century, in a country like Australia, for example, or the US or the UK, it's not progressive. And it makes us feel uncomfortable, especially in societies where there's two breadwinners and the Muslim man and the woman are actually contributing to whatever expenses that they have.
I think what's so interesting about this question is that Muslim scholars dealt with this hundreds of years ago too, and that what happens is that this naturally arises. It's not only our society today that is now confronted with, okay, well, women, what about in situations where women are responsible for providing? And what they did was they took principles, they took methods within Islamic law, and they catered them to these needs. So one of the biggest solutions that they offered to this was through what is called the waqf system, the endowment system. And what you see historically is that in order to quote unquote balance the amount of wealth that a daughter inherits, that what you would have is that male family members would open charitable endowments in a way that would ensure that the profits of those endowments would be inheritable by their female daughters. And something that Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj, who we have at Yaqeen here, what he said, simply, at least in our day and age, he said, if this is such a huge problem, that and there are ways to get around it, ways that we can use historically, we can look at the waqf system and how institutions were built in order to ensure that female family members were constantly had access to wealth. But even today, it's almost as if we wait until someone is on their deathbed before we think to ourselves, well, let's gift our daughters or let's gift our family members or take care of our female family members in different ways. And that this is something simple, that the wealth that we have today can be distributed while we're alive and well. And that's not the only solution. There are solutions within the Islamic tradition, within Islamic law, that use the principles inherent that can really navigate these issues. And so even if something seems like it is absolutely certain and solid and imperceptible to change, that's not the case. And that's never the case with any Islamic ruling.
Jazakallah khair. And I think we're going to hit you up for a deep dive on this topic of inheritance, because it's so rich. And I'd love to go deeper, frankly. So if I'm hearing you correctly, Dr. Tasneem, so our whole mindset about how we treat rules in Islam is affected by the way we're living, the role of religion in society these days. I get that. I get that there's supposed to be wisdoms behind every ruling in Islam. I get that as well. But if I was going to categorize Islamic rules as kind of the big, bold ideas and rulings, like the inheritance piece, like the divorce piece, into one bucket, and then the other bucket are like really simple, basic sunan, recommendations or, sunnahs, such as walking into the bathroom with your left foot, or walking into the masjid with your right foot, or wiping, your socks in a certain way. Like they all seem very, very minute. And for me, you're saying that there's all these rules are constructed to bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and whatnot. But I struggle to make that connection between these very, very basic rules, very simple rules, and God consciousness. So how do I find the wisdom in these small things?
So this is a great question. Sometimes you feel like you just can't understand everything that you have to do. And there's a couple of ways that you can think about this. Number one, it's the reality that the idea of religion is not meant for you to have all of the answers immediately in front of you, knowing, all of the wisdoms that God has planned. But the idea of being a Muslim is to literally submit. And that's to submit to the unseen, to submit to the unknown. And so some things are not going to have an explanation. And I think that's okay. And we need to be okay with that. Because when we understand the bigger picture, when we understand Islam holistically, it's something that can settle within our hearts. There are still questions to this day. And I've been on this track studying Islamic studies for several years now. There's still questions to this day that I just can't get the answer to. But you know what? I think to myself, everything else makes perfect sense. That Islam provides this comprehensive, holistic lifestyle. It's okay if I can't answer all of the empty boxes. And I think that what happens is that we have this natural inclination to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater. And you see this happen historically. There is, a really famous incident that I like to explain because I think it really brings together the idea of questioning where we get our questions from, but also the balance of just kind of stepping back and understanding. And that is about the Hadith of the fly. Now, for those of you who haven't heard about it, it's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where essentially he says that if a fly lands in your cup, dip it completely before you take it out. And, for a few
I'm glad you bring this up, by the way, because I've had that burning question. It's confusing.
Yeah, it's confusing.
Just the fact that Islam has gone to that depth, that if a fly lands in your cup, there's a certain way to treat it. Honestly, is astonishing. So yeah, I'd love to hear it.
It's astonishing in so many ways because one, you might think like this is, oh, come on, another rule. And then for some people, they thought, and you have specific cases in the early 20th century, you have a few leading thought leaders in Egypt who, had this very religious upbringing, and they're confronted with this hadith. And they think to themselves, you know what, this is kind of the tipping point that Islam is clearly irrational, and you know what, we can't take the hadith, this hadith nor any hadith. And I think we do this a lot today, that you know what, there's this one hadith that I can't understand, so all of it is gone. And what happens is that you think about the context. You got to really set the stage. These are Egyptian thought leaders at the turn of the 20th century. What's happening in Egypt at the time? You've got occupation after occupation. You've got colonial powers that are really dominating Egypt. And you've got the Ottoman Empire, which was, the peak Muslim civilization for centuries, is now crumbling down before their eyes. And so I'm here, imagine yourself being there. I'm going to feel very embarrassed by my religious identity. This is now when you've got post-enlightenment. Now everyone's turning away from this obsession with religion, and now we're thinking scientifically, and so here I am as a Muslim, like I'm being conquered, I'm being dominated. Clearly there might be something wrong with my religion, that maybe it's incompatible, maybe just doesn't make sense, and you know what, there's some things we just got to get rid of, right? And so it's really funny because I think this is something that we do today. And what happens is that with this particular example of the hadith of the fly, is that just a couple decades later, scientific research comes out and says that, there's actually antibodies on the fly's wings, and essentially proves that it's actually safer if you dip the fly into the cup. And really, I love this example because sometimes at that moment, you're not going to know the answer. And you know what? You might not ever know it. They might not have lived to hear that answer. But some things you sort of have to really just understand that you won't know the answer, or that you might find it at a later time. And it's the way we react is so vastly different than the way hadith scholars and Muslim scholars throughout history reacted. Because it's not like, oh, this is the first time the hadith of the fly ever popped up. Like one day they're flipping through a book and now, oh, this new hadith came out. These types of hadith were confronted by hadith scholars centuries before. And you have someone like Ibn Hajar, who writes one of the biggest tafsir, this sort of like this commentary edition on al-Bukhari Sahih of the hadith corpus, right? And as he's going through, writing through his commentary, he comes across a hadith that says, that when Adam alayhi salam was created, he was created at 60 arms length, and that sort of as history progresses, man will continue to shrink. And Ibn Hajar kind of looks around him and he recognizes the fact that a lot of the ancient homes that were in his area that were hundreds, if not thousands of years old, were the same size of his home that day. And he's thinking to himself, well, that doesn't make sense because then those homes would have been bigger. So what does he do? He moves on. He's like, all right, flip the page, you continue on. And that's really a lot of times just the attitude we need to have, because he recognized that, he's like, I don't know the answer to this, but I see the whole Hadith corpus in front of me. I know Islam. I've lived and experienced Islam, and I know that it only brings me benefit, and it makes holistic, rational sense. And that's enough for me. And sometimes it's got to be, something that we just have to really come to terms with, that you can't know everything, and really have that intellectual humility as you go along this journey.
Jazakallah khair. Dr. Tesneem, we're going to jump to the rapid fire in a sec, but I do want to close off with a very simple question. And that's a question on behalf of my 9-year-old niece. She comes to you, Dr. Tesneem, and says, look, I go to a non-Muslim school. Most people don't practice Islam and practice religion in general. And when I do try to practice my religion, I realize that actually there are so many rules. And I'm worried that Islam is too difficult. So do I throw in the towel now because Islam is too difficult and too burdensome? Or is there light at the end of the tunnel? How do you respond to the 9-year-old girl?
I would respond with exactly the words of the Prophet ﷺ, Inna ad-dina yusr. Religion is easy. وَلَنْ يُشَادَ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ. That if you make it hard, it's going to be hard. فَسَدِّدُوا وَقَارِبُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا. That just make your intention where you balance out your actions. Make the intention that what you want to do is to please Allah, and you're going to just get what you need to get done. You're going to pray your 5 prayers. You're going to do what you have to do. Everything else is an opportunity. Think of it as an opportunity to keep going further, but it's not something that you need to ever feel burdened by. And I love how this hadith includes right after this, وَأَبْشِرُوا. Give glad tidings. Because to me, that's really, anytime I feel like I'm taking it too tough on myself, I think of this. The Prophet is like, listen, man, religion's easy. And you want to make it hard, it's only going to be hard on yourself. Don't make it hard, essentially. Be balanced and give good glad tidings, because look around, tell people about the good that you experience from religion. Talk about the good aspects and everything that we benefit from, because that really is the ultimate goal, that we're becoming better humans as a result of it, that religion is easy and it's something that is just to be proud of and to really talk about with joy and excitement.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Tesneem. Thank you so much. We're going to up the ante a little bit and change gears from this topic to something a little bit easier, hopefully less burdensome than the heavy topic of Islam being too difficult. I'm going to jump to a couple of quick questions, and you've got 10 seconds to answer each one. Are you ready?
I'm so nervous. Bismillah.
All right, we'll start off easily. Your favorite qari, your favorite reciter of the Quran?
Oh, easy. Yasir al-Dusri.
Yasir al-Dusri, did you say?
Yasir al-Dusri, yeah.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
Oh, yeah?
Someone chose the one that... So I met him a couple of times. I tried to pull him to Australia to visit. And his answer to me was, sure, I'll come to Australia if you can do me one favor. What's that? Bring Australia closer to me. So it didn't work out.
That's exactly how
amazing.
I feel. No, his voice is incredible and it's powerful and I love it.
I love it. Yeah. Alhamdulillah that he's Imam of the Haram now. What's the last book you were reading?
Which language? I like to...
Which languages do you have?
I actually just finished my first Turkish novel, which was really exciting. And I like to keep a set of different
You read
books.
Turkish?
Yes, I picked
Mashallah.
up Turkish past few years, alhamdulillah. And it's been so much fun. That was just the novel. It was my English book that I'm reading is called Cynical Theories. I sound so lame, but it talks about the effects of postmodernism on the academy. And then for Arabic, one of my favorite authors, Abu Zahra, has a biography on Imam Malik, and he just writes so well, and I'm enjoying reading that.
Mashallah, Jazakallah khair. Just a Turkish novel. Just a Turkish novel.
Hey,
What's your dream
breakfast?
What's your dream breakfast?
Dream breakfast, coffee, and just a light snack. I don't like to start my day too heavy. Protein bar usually, the perfect bars. It's shameless plug. Those things are so good. Tastes like you're eating cookie dough. I don't know if you have them in Australia.
No, I don't think we do. We probably do, but I'm on a diet every week, a different diet. So I get to try new things, but they don't sound like cookie dough. If you could have dinner with one person from history, who would it be? And it's obviously not the Prophet ﷺ, because that would be your first choice, of course.
Aisha radiallahu anha, I don't know if that counts, but I'm obsessed with her, and there's so many questions I would love to ask her.
Okay. So you're the director of expanded learning at Yaqeen. What are you expanding?
So basically what we do is we take those papers that are 40, 50 pages sometimes, and we expand the ways you can access them. So we create products like curriculum, conviction circles, conversations decks. Basically, how can you talk about the same topic, get to the same type of information without necessarily just being by yourself and reading through a long paper? So doing it in a classroom, doing it with friends, just really giving you more opportunities to learn in a cool, different environment.
Amazing. You know, typically before we interview any guest on DoubleTake, our amazing team and our producer, Brother Tariq, does such a diligent job at digging through our guests' social media profiles. So he went through Facebook, he went through Twitter, he went through Instagram, and he couldn't find you on social media. So why is that?
Get off while you can. Social media, if there's hasn't been enough studies in documentaries, is toxic, and I personally find that for me the harm was greater than the good. And really, if I'm just trying to be like human and honest, it takes away from my focus, and I'm thinking about constantly scrolling and checking in notifications, and then I lose brain power to do things that are more important in my life. So I recommend you getting off.
So if you've got so much time, because you're not on social media, if you had unlimited resources and you could put together a dream service for Muslims, what would Dr. Tesneem Alkiek focus on?
What is it called when you have like those glasses and you can see like an alternate reality?
Augmented reality, like VR, AR.
Yeah, like it would be like an augmented reality where it's like if you have a question or you're thinking about a topic, you can see it sort of across time and space, like how that question has been dealt with, and sort of like different answers from different times and traditions. Because I feel like so often we're just stuck in our bubble and we just think that whatever answer we have in front of us today is the only answer. And I think there's just so much to learn from history, and it really provides perspective and gives you the answers that we're so desperately trying to find today.
Jazakallah khair. You know, normally we say for those who want to find out more about the topic, go to the guest's specific paper on yaqeeninstitute.org. But this time I'm going to say, just go to yaqeeninstitute.org because that's your output. Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyaakum. Jazakallah khairan for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Wa iyaakum.